So welcome everybody to Reasons to Believe, the Chicago chapter. Reasons to Believe is an international nonprofit organization founded by astrophysicist Hugh Ross, who became a Christian when he read Genesis in light of his knowledge of science and found it to be amazingly accurate. RTB believes in the book of Revelation, the Bible, and the book of nature as revealed by science. RTB seeks to test the hypothesis that there really isn't any tension between science and the Bible, and that any tension that might exist is a result of misinterpretation or misunderstanding. Sound science, testable truth is the motto of RTB. RTB has a robust website at reasons.org. I encourage you to go look at the website and search around in it if you haven't done that before. The Chicago chapter of RTB has a page on the reasons.org website where you can find a calendar of events coming up. As soon as I get them up there, we have speakers lined up through December right now. We meet the second Saturday of every month at 10 a.m. Central Standard Time. We meet in person and we meet over Zoom, so you don't even have to be close to us to join in, but you're certainly welcome to show up in person. We have a Facebook page that you can find by searching Reasons to Believe Chicago. We have a YouTube page which you can find with the same search, Reasons to Believe Chicago. If you haven't done it and you're sitting here and watching, or you're listening after the fact, please pull up your phone, go to YouTube, search for Reasons to Believe Chicago, and like the YouTube page. We need to get the likes up to a certain level before we can have a unique URL, so you will help us out if you would do that. So our upcoming events, in October, we have Pat McGuire talking to us about recent advances in cosmology and astronomy and their implications. In November, Pat Perez is going to talk to us about making sense of mass shootings, a little departure from our usual science topic, although it may be scientific, we'll have to see. And then in December, Vaughn Mancha is going to present to us on epigenetics. I don't have a title for that talk yet. But today, we have Dr. Joseph R. Miller with us from sunny Arizona. He's an assistant professor of Christian worldview at Grand Canyon State University, the largest private Christian university in the world. He began his career, though, at Pennsylvania State University with a bachelor's degree in architectural engineering. But he wasn't satisfied with one degree. He went on to get at least 5 more. He's got an MDiv from Oral Roberts University, a Master of Arts in Science and Religion from Southern California Seminary, a Doctorate of Ministry from Biola University, a Master of Theology from Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and a PhD in physics from the same institution. Dr. Miller has authored many books and articles on leadership, church history, biblical theology. His latest book, One Lord, One Faith, One Baptism, Spirit Baptism, and Christian Unity. And he has a blog site at morethancake.org. I love that name. And here today to talk to us about Hebrew cosmology is Dr. Miller.
Hey, thank you all for having me, even remotely. I was telling the guys before we got started, the original plan was to be out there, and then all of a sudden, I got this opportunity to teach full-time here at Grand Canyon University in Phoenix. So I just finished moving from San Diego, getting settled in my house. You can see behind me, we got the coffee bar set up. So that was the priority. Once we got that set up, everything else, we can take time for that. But can get coffee in the morning, so we're good to go here. But I just started teaching classes this week. It's my first full week of classes. I have 282 students in 4 different classes, all of Christian worldview right now. And I know that I just want to say one thing, that when we watch the news, and I'll say I put myself in this category, I think it's easy to get discouraged with what's happening in our world, with the lack of, even in the church, there seems to be a diminishing of a search for the truth and an interest in conform into culture. But I'll tell you what I discovered at Grand Canyon, I've been very encouraged. They have about 25,000 students on ground here, 90,000 online. And this course in Christian worldview is taught to every single student. It's a required course. And so we have about 10,000 a year that go through this course. And it's very much focused on presenting a robust, biblically sound, theologically sound Christian worldview to these young men and women who are going to be, taking the helm in years to come once they graduate of various places in our nation. So be encouraged. I think the folks at Reasons to Believe are doing good work, obviously, as a fellow for them. I think they're making headway amongst a lot of academics. So I'm encouraged, and I want you to be encouraged too, that God is doing good things in the world. It's just we don't hear enough about them. So with that, a little bit of little diatribe there. I want to focus today on this idea of what makes Genesis different. There's been one of those trends I think we've seen in recent years is to try to make the Bible acceptable to the culture, and those things that are difficult to accept, we just say, well, we'll find a way to get around those. We'll just kind of change the way we interpret the text. And so I think that's created some challenges because we're no longer letting the text speak. As Hugh Ross would say, this book of God, this text of the Bible is one book. There's the book of nature, but a lot of them, I think, are reading the book of culture, unfortunately, and saying, hey, we need to have that as an authority. So I wanted to go back to the text here in this and look at what makes Genesis different and some of those key aspects to that. All right. There, oops. So here's the key text, the one we're all looking at. Whoops. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And that's the beginning of one of, I think, the most amazing stories ever told, the origin story, where we begin. But the question that seems to come up is this myth? Is this history? It's not a new question. As people have asked since the beginning, can we believe God? Can we trust God? Can we rely on this revelation story to tell us the truth about where we came from? But I think it's new, and for what's new for us is within sort of the evangelical branch of the church, there seems to be a lot more push to say Genesis is less history and more myth. Even if we put it on a spectrum between myth and history, it's a little bit of both. There's this push to say, well, the parts that are incompatible with the consensus of animal to human evolution, those clearly must be myths. So there's been this exploration of trying to find that answer. So I want to define a couple key terms before I get over this, because what I want to do is compare the myth, what is the myth that was common in the ancient Near East, to what I believe is the revelation of a historical origin given to us in Genesis 1. So I lean on that history side, and I'll kind of unpack why I say that and what that means in terms of our interpretation of Genesis. But when we say the myth of the ancient Near East, so the ancient Near East is the context, it's the backdrop. Israel was a part of the ancient Near East. And these stories come out of the ancient Near East. So that's a term. You'll hear me use that term, but I wanted to make sure people were not getting lost just on that basic term. So the ancient Near East is a term used to describe the numerous civilizations spanning the 4th millennia BC through the Bronze and Iron Ages into the 4th century, that should be not into the 4th. So into like this, that should be I believe we're talking about the 2nd century BC. Where the Persians fell to Alexander the Great. So that's in the closer to the 1st century BC. The ancient Near East covered the landmass occupied by the modern countries of Egypt, Iran, Iraq, Israel, Kuwait, Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, and Turkey. So those are the modern regions that are really today, that whole landmass area. So it's, we're talking about three, you know, many centuries, many different kinds of cultures, a very diversity of groups and peoples. And that's important to understand that there's a real diversity of groups. Not all of those groups function the same. And a lot of times what you see in the literature is that we talk about the ancient Near East as if it's this sort of one monolithic approach. But when you can talk about something over centuries, over millennia, over such a diverse region with different kinds of people, I think that story that there's this one sort of ancient Near East mindset, way of looking at the world falls apart a little bit, because there was no such thing as a unified. I mean, you can't even find that in the United States, where there's one way of looking at stuff between the South. And we got people on today, mostly out in Chicago, but some down in Florida, some, Phoenix, California. There's you'll find regional differences and diversities of ideas. So I think that's not too far out of the norm to understand that there's that diversity. The other term I just want to mention was cosmogony or cosmology. Those terms I'm going to use interchangeably. Some people use them to mean something very different, but I'll just use them to mean basically a system of thought that attempts to explain the origins of the universe in scientific, philosophical, and or theological terms. Now, not all of those are necessarily true, because some don't use science, or, so there's a variety of mix of what they'll bring in, but it could use any of those things to try to explain, hey, where did we come from? That's all we mean by cosmology or cosmogony. The other term I wanted to bring out was a worldview. Because what I want to explain to you guys today, or try to show you, is how the Hebrew worldview, the way that Israel saw the world, was radically different than their ancient Near East neighbors. And one of the things that happens is, as you're reading the arguments that kind of push Genesis towards the myth side of the spectrum, is that they'll argue that, well, the Hebrews had the same basic worldview as all of their ancient Near East neighbors, so they saw creation through that same ancient Near East worldview lens. Again, the assumption is that they had a unified worldview with their neighbors, and also that there was any such thing as a single worldview that governed the ancient Near East. So I think there's two mistakes in that sort of statement. But here's what a worldview is. The term worldview is used to describe the lens we use to interpret the world and focus our observations into a clear narrative that answers the questions of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. So whether it was the Akkadians or the Egyptians or Israel, they're all trying to say, what is our origin? Where do we start? What's the meaning of life? Why are we here? What is morally right? What is wrong? And what is the destiny we're going to end up to? So all of these ancient myths outside of Israel, these cosmologies, we're all trying to answer those key areas of origin, meaning, morality, destiny. And this we'll begin to see is because Israel had such a radically different view of origin, meaning, morality, and destiny. We'll see that they didn't share a worldview with these ancient Near East neighbors. And consequently, the text that we have in Genesis looked at the world, tells us a very different story about our origin. And the last word I want to kind of define for you that's kind of interesting is called a paradigm. Now, a paradigm functions inside our worldview, providing a field-specific framework for epistemic inquiry, epistemological inquiry. In other words, it's a way of taking, okay, here's our story, here's the way we view the world, and now let me apply that story to physics. Let me apply that to chemistry. Let me apply it to biology. Let me apply it to philosophy. Let me apply it to theology. So whatever field you're kind of looking at, a paradigm is the way we say, okay, how do I take my worldview and connect it to that specific field of study? In this case, here's our worldview. Let's apply it to Genesis. Is how we're understanding that. And we're using science, which takes the worldview, and we have a paradigm for understanding that. That's what the RTB model is all about, right? Taking the book of nature in the book of God and saying, how do we take this Christian worldview and understand those two different fields of study? And so when we do that, it determines what counts as knowledge and how it should be applied to other fields of inquiry, right? So that's why we're trying to get this marriage. So we use paradigms then to help us say, hey, how does scripture relate to astrophysics? How does scripture relate to anthropology? So that's how that's how paradigms function. So leads us to there's two competing ideas when it comes to Genesis. Now there's certainly more than that, but I'm just going to compare these two competing ideas today. So there's what I would call the convergent worldview paradigm. Now you see why I had to define those terms for you guys, right? So there's a convergent worldview paradigm. In other words, there's a way that obviously the people and the events of Genesis 1 through 3, people argue are literary symbols with little or no relationship to the history or material realities of the cosmos. So what's happening here is for those who would argue that Israel, their worldview converged. It was the same. There was a meeting of those worldviews, and that therefore they had the same paradigm. They had the same way of interpreting the idea of human origins and cosmic origins. So this idea that Israel converges with the ancient Near East, that's this first view. Consequently, the people argue that Genesis 1 through 11 again, these people are not necessarily historical figures, or maybe there were people like this in history, but Genesis 1 through 11 doesn't really tell us about those real historical people. They tell us a theological version of those people. They become symbols of what God really wants to tell us, of a deeper, more religious message. So because of this idea that if Israel is looking at the world through the same ancient Near East lens, then we don't have to interpret those events like Adam and Eve or anything that really Genesis 1 through 11 as real historical events or people. They can just become symbols of a better, bigger meaning, that God has for us. So that's their first thing that this sort of convergent worldview paradigm will do. And they'll argue, like every other people group in the ancient Near East, the Hebrew priests and scribes use the mythologies because they're describing, in their view, again, these words as some sort of mythology of Genesis to teach important religious truths and to justify Israel's temple practices. So the argument goes something like this. Hey, just like every other ancient Near East civilization, they created these origin stories to justify, hey, this is why we sacrifice to, our god, Baal, right? Or this is why we sacrifice to, this is why we do worship to, some Egyptian god. So they tell these stories to justify their religious practice or to, give justification for why they are the true religion, the true people of God. And so what these people argue is that just like every other civilization did that, Israel did this. Now they'll say, well, certainly they were motivated because we believe in the one true God. But so God sort of gave them these myths to justify their belief, the temple practices of Israel. So these myths were used to say, hey, our temple worship is the right temple worship. So the idea then again is that it's less about the history and more about just justifying their religious practices. And so that's the second point that they'll make. And then the third point is they'll make, there's a clear unity, they say, between Genesis and other ancient cosmologies. And we'll look at a couple of examples of this. But they'll say is, hey, when Genesis talks about, God speaking things into existence, we can find Egyptian stories that talk about similar things. Oh, well, therefore, see, they're all telling the same myth, the same stories. It's just we sort of believe that Genesis is telling us the true myth, not a false myth. But we can find these points of unity, they'll say. And I think all of these three things, from my view, are incorrect. I don't agree with any of these 3 points. And that's why I end up with what I call the divergent worldview paradigms. So the only word that's here is the word convergent to the word divergent. In other words, the view that Israel had diverged from the worldview of the ancient Near East, and therefore they had a different paradigm. They have a different way of applying that knowledge that they received from God, the story of Genesis, that gives them a different way of interpreting the world around them. So they were very different, I think, in significant ways. Not that they were still not a people of the culture. They still had elements of Genesis that are connected to the culture. It made sense to them because it was their world. But those elements that they used to make sense, like the historical people and places and customs, those then were used to those were reinterpreted in light of the truth that God had revealed, these historical events of human origins. So it's not that the customs were used to invent stories of origins as it was in the other ancient Near East civilizations. So like I say here, in contrast to those who read Genesis 1 through 11 as myth, my own study leads me to the conclusion that the story of Genesis is historical narrative with a theological purpose. And that's what I call theo-history. So it's a historical narrative, but it's not like a history that we would read in our textbooks today. And this is why it seems foreign to us. And this is why people can be convinced that Genesis is some sort of mythology. Well, it doesn't, because it doesn't read like a textbook you would get in elementary school or a textbook you get in college. On this date, this time, let me give you all the facts and figures. It tells history, but it's telling it for a very theological purpose. So it does leave out some elements. Some things aren't said that we would expect in a history, and that's fine. It doesn't mean it's not history. It just means it's a different kind of history. And so it's God's story. It's God's narrative. It's theo-history. It's God's history. So that's important. It's not myth. That doesn't make it a myth. It just makes it a different kind of history. So scholars like me in this camp would argue that while the literary style of Genesis has elements common to other ancient mythologies, the content itself is quite distinct. So the essential elements of the Hebrew origin stories are distinct from other ancient mythologies, and similar only in their secondary, or what philosophers, if you're that, will call accidental elements. So they certainly have elements in common. I mean, it's funny when you read this stuff, it's like, hey, well, Genesis talks about the seas. And then we have this Akkadian, myth that talks about the seas. See, they're all talking about the seas. Therefore, they're all mythologies. It really takes these, what are common observational things, skies and sea, or heavens and earth, and says, see, they're all talking about the same thing. They're all myth. So, well, no, there's still humans that lived in the world. They still see seas and skies and heavens, but that doesn't mean the substance of what they're saying is not distinct. And so we'll unpack that a little bit too, but the main point is that Israel's worldview and the way they interpreted the world was very different. It diverged from their neighbors in the ancient Near East. So how should we understand Genesis? Again, we just looked at the convergent worldview paradigm, or should we look at this divergent worldview paradigm? So those are two basic things we're going to compare. And again, I understand if you read literature, anybody who's read this stuff that's watching, say, oh, there's certainly more than that. Yes. But I'm kind of looking at these two categories of understanding Genesis and trying to put folks in basically these two camps so that we can kind of compare and contrast and make some better decisions on how we want to understand Genesis. So here's a little table that gives these two paradigms as they relate to science. And this is, I think, particularly of interest as an RTB group. And I think you'll see in this elements of what the reasons to believe model is, that you'll see Fuzz and Hugh and those guys sort of talk about as they deal with science. So for the unified worldview paradigm, those that say Genesis is some sort of myth or mytho-history, they say Hebrew cosmology is ancient Near East cosmology with no revelatory value towards science. So they won't deny that it's revelatory. They'll say, oh, it's still God's word, it's still revelation, but it tells us nothing that would be relevant to the exploration of science. The divergent worldview paradigm says, no, there is revelatory value for doing science, for scientific exploration. It's not a science textbook, but because it tells us about our real origins in space and time, it has value for our scientific work. The unified worldview paradigm says Hebrew cosmology is concerned only with functional and never material origins, but the divergent worldview paradigm says no, that it is telling us both functional and material origins. So when it says God spoke light into existence, it's talking about real light. When it says he created the stars, the sun, and the moon, he means the text means the real sun, the real moon. That's the physical material reality that we say. For those of this sort of unified worldview, they're saying, no, it's just the sun is a symbol of God's light-giving power or something. They'll have different ways of speaking of that, but it's really not, they'll say, talking about the actual sun. So the other third area of difference here is Hebrew cosmology, for those of them with this unified worldview paradigm, that relies on the language of accommodation and rejects the validity of a literal hermeneutic. So there's no way that literally we can approach this text at all. But the divergent worldview says, no, there is some concordism. There is some sort of, and what Hugh Ross talks about is the moderate concordism that happens. But it also accepts the validity of some kind of literal hermeneutic. Some sort of say that, yes, again, these are real things, real events, real historical people being discussed. The last area of difference is Hebrew cosmology, for those of the unified worldview paradigm, is teleology with no regard to scientific methodology. So it's an origin story. That's all teleology is. It's an origin story, but there's no method under which we could say this gives us a scientific framework to look at anything. For those in the divergent worldview paradigm, which RTB again would fall under, Hebrew cosmology is teleology, and in some cases may speak to scientific methodology. So not in every case, not everything that's there, but we're saying, hey, there's a way we can understand this text that it gives us some way that we could methodologically approach our scientific process. And so these different views, again, are impact not just the way we understand Genesis, impacts not just the way we think our theology of Genesis, but the way we do science. Okay, so there's a few implications of this divergent worldview paradigm I want us to look at. First, that Hebrew cosmology reflects a unique worldview shaped by divine revelation. This is, for me, a fundamental thing that can't be rejected, because there is revelation comes first, right? Then the revelation of God of how things began shapes Israel's worldview. The other model, this unified worldview paradigm, almost wants to flip that. They'll say, well, yes, sort of divine revelation comes in there, but uses the existing worldview to kind of start to tweak it and shape that worldview, which is still fundamentally the same as other ancient Near East civilizations. And so I just think it's the other way around, obviously. I think revelation comes first, then worldview comes, with a radical departure for Israel from seeing the world radically different than their neighbors. Again, Genesis is Theo-History. That's the genre. That's the literary style. It's historical narrative is another way of saying that, but it's certainly not ancient Near East mythology, and it certainly tells us something true about our material origins. And ultimately, this means that Hebrew cosmology offers a dependable foundation for knowing something true about our material origins, shaping ethical priorities. And that's actually, for me as an ethicist, something that's really important. That if we lose Genesis as a revelation of genuine origins, it changes our ethics. It changes our ethical priorities. But it's also good for directing moral decision-making and guiding scientific inquiry. And I think all those things are key to understanding Hebrew cosmology. So what are three essential elements of this Hebrew worldview? There's three pieces here that I want us to look at. Genesis is monotheism, not polytheistic or panentheistic is a word that I'll use today, and I'll explain that. Genesis is special revelation, not cultic theology. In other words, God has given us a special revelation. It's not a theology of worship. It's not a theology to justify worship practices. Genesis justifies the worship practices because it's special revelation. It's not written after the fact to justify why Israel worshiped the way they worship. And the third thing is Genesis is theo-history, not mytho-history. And that's a term William Lane Craig has used in his most recent book on Adam and his quest to discover the historical Adam. And he says that Genesis is a mytho-history, that yes, Adam was a historical person, but to be honest, the short of it is, from his view, Genesis just doesn't tell us anything about that historical Adam. It tells us there was one, but we know nothing about that historical Adam really from Genesis. We have to turn to science to tell us to learn about historical Adam and Eve as basically evolved hominids from lower animals. And so it's more of a theistic evolutionary model for Craig's mytho-history. So, I think again, it's more theo-history. So let me look at Genesis as monotheism, not panentheism. So that's not pantheism, it's panentheism. And this is where I'll use two terms. So certainly the world that Israel's in was polytheistic. Polytheism is belief is inhabited by many finite gods, driven by their many human-like desires, such as sexual pleasure, who ruled over their own spatial domain. So, you read this in the ancient text, the gods who are formed from various bodily emissions like blood, or actually, gods who spawned other gods through sexual activity. Even masturbation was one of these stories you read in this sort of thing. It's very graphic in tying the gods to the human experience. There's analogs to the human experience. And that's the kind of polytheism, many small, finite, limited in power gods who are competing. Panentheism, that's a term, it's a modern term, but it was defined by, this definition by Norm Geisler is helpful. It describes this finite godism of polytheism of all these ancient Near East religions, who are, again, limited in power and existed simultaneously both in an actual, what he calls a temporal pole, and a potential eternal pole. And what I like about his version of panentheism, I think it adds an element to polytheism that's unique, is that he's basically emphasizing that somehow these gods were tied in their eternal existence to the temporal existence. So, you'll see one God who is the sun. He is the sun. So in Egyptian mythology, Ra, the sun god, he actually had three different forms of his existence. There was a god for the morning, a god for the afternoon, and a god for the evening. And so, and they all had their own unique name, but there was no distinguishing in large part between their existence as a god and existence as that thing, the sun or the seas, but yet there was an eternal aspect to the gods and a more of a temporal aspect to how that played out in the world. So it gets really interesting how that played out. But that's very, again, different from how the monotheism of Israel. Here's a Egyptian theogony story. Theogony is just a battle of the gods, or telling somehow from one life of one god, the other gods came into existence. In this case, it's the origin story of Atum. It says, "You began becoming. There was no being. There was no void. The world was from you. In the beginning, all other gods came after you." I use this particular sample because I think it's really similar, because this gives you gives you a sense of why certain people want to interpret Genesis as the same as other ancient Near East mythologies. So it uses the word, say, "Oh, you began becoming. There was no being. There was a void." So, that sounds like Genesis. In the beginning, there was, in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. It was formless and void, and God put everything in it. So this literally is where people will take stuff and say, see, it's talking about this great void. And it's talking about a very specific beginning to things. See, Hebrew cosmology is ancient Near East cosmology. Well, I think using words like void and became and come into being are not the key elements to understanding this Egyptian, theogony. It's not how we understand this origin story. What is the key is the polytheistic or the panentheistic nature of that. So this idea that the god Atum is the source of all, the fountainhead of all other gods. That's the key here. It's not that there was nothing before in a material reality. It's that there was a god, a first primary god, and all the other gods came from him. And this was used by the Egyptians to say, okay, Atum is the god of our city, so therefore our city is better than your city because your god, well, he's a real god. There's a god like you have, but he came from our god. And that's how these stories were used to say, our city is better, our political structures should have dominance. And when we now have reason why we can attack you and take you over because you're worshiping a lesser god than our God. Not a God who doesn't exist, just a lesser God. And so these Egyptian mythologies, the Akkadian mythologies, all these sort of things were used to justify their political actions and warlike postures against other people. But that's not how Genesis was used. It says in the beginning, there was nothing except God. And so the material reality that came into existence was not in competition. And anything that you might worship as a god is not a god at all. There's only one God. And that's a very different way of interpreting the text that's crucial to understanding. Second is Genesis is a special revelation, not cultic theology. And in the literature, just by the way, when I say cultic theology, the cult, people can even say that is the cultic practices of Israel. They don't mean like cult, like we use it like in a religious sense, like there's a religious cult, like the David Koresh, those sort of things. They mean just simply worship practices, the temple worship, the sacrifices, all those things are called cultic practices. So the cultic theology, in other words, the temple theology or the temple worship practices, it's not the same thing. It's special revelation. I'll start here with an example. This is the Akkadian epic of Enuma Elish. That's one of the more common ones used because there's a lot. It's one of the more better preserved cosmologies from the ancient world. It says this: Tiamat and Marduk, sage of the gods, drew close for battle. They locked in single combat, joining for the fray. After the vanguard had slain Tiamat, he scattered, that is, Marduk scattered her forces. He dispersed her host. So in other words, this is this cosmic battle taking place. And in this cosmic battle, Marduk takes Tiamat, destroys her armies, and eventually Marduk takes Tiamat's body, rips her body in half. Half becomes the skies, half becomes the land. So this is interesting because in truth, it's funny because those that are this convergent worldview paradigm say, well, Genesis has nothing to do with material origins because no ancient mythologies have to do with material origins. And I just don't even understand that assertion because I think, as I read it, all ancient Near East mythologies care about material origins. It's trying to explain the origins of the sky and the sea through the body of a god being destroyed, in battle and torn apart. And that's literally where we get the skies and the sea, is the body of Tiamat. So it does care. All ancient Near East mythologies cared about our material origins. They just explain them in such a radically different way, in this case, between the battle of the gods. And this then again was used to justify the temple practices. So therefore, that's why some groups say we worship Marduk because he is greater than Tiamat. This is our temple. This is what we do. But let me give a couple key terms as far as revelation go that I think are relevant to understanding Genesis. So revelation, we talk about the Bible being revealed. It tells both God's special revelation of himself, the Tanakh, which is just the word for the Hebrew Old Testament, and God's general revelation of himself and nature, which together have epistemic or truth value for understanding the transcendent reality of God and the immanent reality of creation. So revelation, we speak of the revelation of God, there's special revelation and general revelation. Both give us insight. Yes, we our hermeneutic, the way we read those things are different, but they still give us insight about God and about our world. So general revelation is the evidence of God's existence, power, and moral qualities available to all mankind in every generation from observation of the natural world. And this, I would argue, is important because when we understand this as Christians and as the Jews understood this, that's why these stories of these ancient mythologies that competed with Israel's, what I would call as a history of the world, that's why they're so similar in some aspects, not because they had a common myth, they had a common legend or a common desire to, justify their worship practices, because these people had the same general revelation of God as we do today. They knew that there was a God, they knew he was a creator, but as Paul says in Romans, they subverted that, they changed that, they suppressed that knowledge and exchanged it for the worship of false gods and false idols. So, when the Egyptians said there was a void and this one God rose to power out of the void and created all the other gods, I think that they had some latent understanding of God's genuine story of creation, but they just, again, over time, they distorted general revelation and to the point where nature itself became their authority, not the special revelation of God. So again, special revelation being that which is recorded in the Tanakh or the Old Testament, given by God through direct inspiration of human writers, which gives both evidence that advances human knowledge about general revelation, which is science, and unique insight into his purposes. So the ones that are sort of the mytho-history crowd want to say, no, we want to cut out revelation, special revelation doesn't give us knowledge about the natural world. It only gives us knowledge about God's purposes. So they have to cut that part out because they need to accept really what is the scientific consensus view of animal to human evolution. That's really the linchpin for all of this stuff. It's a way of reinterpreting Genesis to just understand that. And the third and last one here is Genesis is theo-history, not mytho-history. And I've already talked about this one a little bit, but I do believe this is a core element of how we need to understand Genesis. So let's look at the Akkadian myth depicting the creation of mankind. On the first of the month, the 7th and 15th days, I will prepare a purification, a bath. Let one God be slain, and let the gods be purified by immersion. In his flesh and his blood, let Nintu mix clay, God and man. Let them together be smeared with clay. Unto eternity, let us hear the drum. So now this one I picked because notice how it talks about the mixing of with clay. So honestly, what happens is this word clay is used by certain ancient Near East scholars to say, oh, we'll see in Genesis 2, it talks about man being formed out of the dust of the ground. And here we're talking about man being formed and humans out of clay. See, they're all telling the same mytho-history. They're all telling a mythology of origins to justify temple practices, to justify their worship, to justify that their God is their God. I would flip it on the opposite. It's not that kind of mytho-history. It's a theo-history. So in other words, I believe that God truly formed Adam out of the dust of the ground. I think he formed Eve out of his side, out of his flesh came Eve. I think that is a literal telling of the historical event of how men and women came into existence with the first two humans, became biological ancestors of every living human. And I think the fact that God formed them out of the dust is the real historical event. I think the only reason the Akkadian myth uses clay and into their mythology is because they knew some bit of that history. There was a common understanding that God had formed, but they had been darkened by their own desires and passions and their own needs. So they took something that was true historically and created a myth around that historical piece. I think that explains it quite well. I don't need to say that both are based on no revelation of human origins. And again, the only reason I need to say that they are both talking both Genesis and this ancient Near East Akkadian myth, our myth, is if one, I want to justify my belief in animal to human evolution, or two, I just want to say that there's nothing special about God in general, Israel in general. It evolved like every other religion evolved out of, just the hearts of men. So there's no reason to accept this assumption that there's not a special difference within Genesis. And these similarities really come from a distortion of that historical truth, that revelatory truth, and not because both are false. So here's what a myth then again is. A myth was a story used to maintain the status quo of political and religious order. Mythologies reinforced the worldview that events and people were meaningless pawns in a cosmic cycle. Mythologies were rooted in the assumption that human experience is nothing more than a physical analog for the metaphysical drama of the gods. So this is what myth did, is it basically said humans are just these sort of meaningless players in the cosmic battle that's taking place. Humans become slaves to the gods. Humans become expendable. And this is where it gets into the ethical side for me. In ancient myths, if the gods were in battle, it was okay for us to battle. If gods could be slain, humans could be slain. Humans became, the moral choices ended up in devaluing human life. There was no sacredness to human life. In contrast, Genesis tells us we're all what? B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of God. And humans had sacred value. So when Israel went to war against, the Canaanites or whatever, they were enslaved. It wasn't because the Canaanites didn't have sacred value. It was in spite of the fact that they did, because the Canaanites had participated in such grave evil against other human beings, God had to judge that evil. So when Israel went to battle, it's because the sacredness that God had made in every human and implanted in them was being defiled by these ancient civilizations. For these other ancient civilizations and their mythologies, humans had no sacred life. So they went to battle just because they could. They went to battle to prove that they were the dominant force, and they assumed those other people had no value. So even the warlike posture that we might say Israel had versus these other nations was very different. Israel's was to preserve the holiness of God and the sacredness of humanity. The ancients went to battle around Israel because for them there was no sacred worth. There was no value in human life. And we miss that when we try to make Genesis mytho-history. We lose the foundation to make that distinction clear of human sacredness. I'm not saying people still don't want to make it, like William Lane Craig would obviously say all humans are still sacred. But I think when he makes Genesis mytho-history, he gives up ground for making a coherent argument for that truth. And I think he weakens the argument for human sacredness in making it mytho-history. So I think this is maybe the last slide I have, and then we'll go into some discussion. So Hebrew cosmology reflects a unique worldview shaped by divine revelation. And because Genesis was written in the genre of Theo-History, Hebrew cosmology offers us a dependable foundation for knowing something true about our material origins, for shaping our ethical priorities, for safeguarding the sacredness of human life, for directing moral decision-making, for recognizing the significance of historical progress. In other words, we had a beginning, there will be an end, and for guiding scientific inquiry into the book of nature. So Genesis becomes that source for guiding that study into the book of nature. And that's our big key. That's when I'm talking about Genesis, what makes Genesis different. It's those three key elements, but the end product is this right here. This is the significance of that difference. You lose this, you lose some of these elements or all of these elements, or you compromise these elements as soon as we try to make Genesis less than a history of the world. So that's it for the slides. I'll leave that last one up there instead of that one. That one's cute. I like the colors on that slide, but I'll leave this one up, and then we can maybe get into some dialogue with questions about this topic.
I've got a question for you. So, when I was in college studying world religion, I learned in a world religion class from a brilliant professor, Harvard graduate, who was very, it was a secular college, it really wasn't coming from a place of faith, the world religion class I had. I wasn't a Christian. And he made the statement, which I've seen repeated, that something to the effect that Zoroastrianism was the first religion that promoted the concept of one God, and that Zoroastrianism likely influenced the Hebrew religion. And I've gone back to that a number of times over the years, and I've kind of dug into it a little bit. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, in academic studies, the philosophy of religion, if you study that in any secular places, it's simply this: that just like humans evolved, religion evolved. So all religion began as some sort of, nature worship, and then, it advanced in some sort of more complex polytheism, and then of that advanced into some sort of monotheistic view. And so some, again, would maybe, like as your professor, Zoroastrianism. Others might point to other things, as the first monotheistic. But the idea is, in their view, there's nothing. You can explain Israel's views by this simple evolution of religion. And to make that claim, though, the problem is to make that claim, they have to sort of, I think, squint pretty hard, oh, I'm going to just not see certain elements of history. I'm going to see, and they have to kind of put everything into one category. Oh, see, there's this clear progress, except there is no clear progress. We see very huge differences amongst different people groups in these ancient worlds that didn't follow these same kind of processes. And so I think the assumption that they start with is the challenge, right? I think they start with that assumption that that there is this sort of evolution of religion because there's an evolution of human beings. And when they begin with that assumption, they're going to interpret the facts of history through that worldview lens. And it gives them, I think, ultimately a false picture. So I don't think there's any reason to believe that historically. I think it falls apart even on its own. I just don't think it can be sustained with the data. And so I think what makes more sense, I think it makes more sense out of the data to say that every human being began with monotheism. Every human began with an understanding that God was God, that there was only one God, creator. And as they fell into sin, we see the progress of sin, not the progress of religion. We see the progress of sin throughout the world, where people exchange the glory of God for the worship of nature, for the worship of themselves. And that's how we see these other pantheistic or polytheistic religions growing up, is the replacement of one God. And that's why we see similarities then between Israel's monotheistic account of origins and their similarities. It's because they still had some awareness of truth, but they just distorted it with, their sinful desires and nature.
Are you familiar with the research of some of the older people groups around the world today that still are in touch with ancient forms of religion that suggest that there was originally a monotheistic view of the world?
I haven't kept up on that particular bit of scholarship, philosophy of religion. I haven't. That's not my kind of my focus. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if there are some people that argue for original monotheism. I wouldn't be surprised because I think it makes more sense historically. Obviously, I think it's true. I think the Bible would give us that knowledge that it's true. So I wouldn't be surprised that there aren't even some secular people that are starting to say, "Oh no, it was like this." Yeah, that's interesting. And they are secular folks that are making that argument?
Well, I'm thinking specifically of Michael Jones at Inspiring Philosophy. He's got multiple very in-depth and well-documented YouTube videos where he goes through the evidence from Aborigines to Native Americans to other.
Okay, yeah, no, they're good. I think there's a legitimate case that can be made from, what the pieces of information we have that go back, those ancient pieces of information. Again, see, that's a worldview perception, though. The people, if they assume already that there is no God and assume that we evolved and assume that because there is no God, how do you explain all these similarities and stuff? They begin with the assumption that worldview assumption that it just has to evolve naturally on its own. So they, you know, but if you reject that worldview, you can interpret that data very differently. And that's what folks like Jones are doing there as well. And I think that makes more sense. Yeah, absolutely.
I don't want to dominate all the questions.
Yeah.
We have one live in person from Jeff Ashton.
All right. So thanks, Joe. Appreciate the talk and specifically the differentiation between convergent and divergent worldviews. That was really helpful. A couple of questions. Number one, is it true, is it accurate that the Judeo-Christian origin story was kind of late to the game? That in fact these other ones from Egypt and Syria and other things originated earlier? And I've heard the argument made that because the Judeo-Christian story was late to the game, you can see that it was copied, that these elements that you talked about speaking the world into existence and separating the skies from the seas and making man of clay, that, it's because it was late to the game that that's evidence that they just kind of copied and recycled some of these other stories. But is there also an argument to be made from the other side that says, well, wait a minute, if God is going to be introducing himself to these people, and he's introducing himself in a way that's radically different than the gods that they were used to, does it not make sense that he would, present himself in a way that was familiar to them? That these elements he included because he knew they would be expecting that, and that was a way that made it easy for them to see God, not only to understand the origin story, but then to really understand what differentiated him from the other gods.
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think the latter of what you're saying is exactly where I would come down on that, based on my own study of this stuff. A couple points to address there that I think are really important. First, I think we have to look at the worldview assumption behind that first argument, right? That, it came late to the game and it's all, these common elements are there because they did all this stuff. There's an assumption there. One, that there is no such thing as divine revelation. It sort of undermines this concept that Yahweh gave direct revelation. So I say that because it's really critical. Does it matter if it came late? If it was written later, if there was 10,000 stories written before Moses wrote Genesis 1 and 2, does it even matter? No, it doesn't even matter if it was written later. It's irrelevant because the question is it revealed truth, or did he just come up with his own thing to just try to justify his own worship practices? That's really the key that we're talking about. You can't argue just because. So in other words, their view is, well, because I can prove it came after, therefore I can prove it, that's prima facie evidence that it was just a story that built itself on these older stories. that's just not true. I mean, just because it came later doesn't mean it was dependent on those stories for its truth value. So that assumption of which came first really doesn't prove what they think it proves. It only proves it because they've already made the assumption, if I can prove it was written later, it proves it's not revelation from Yahweh. Does that part make sense? So that's the often unaddressed assumption in that I would first attack. It's sort of this it's this presupposed thing that must be true. If I can prove the timeline, therefore it proves my whole point, and that it's a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. So that's the first point, and the second point is I think, and you sort of more alluded to this point in your comment or your question, and I think that's true, is the reason there were common elements is because they still were people living in an ancient world. So God was using what they knew around them. So he'd use, like if I said, I'm telling you a story about the United States, and I mentioned the city of Chicago, right? And I talk about Chicago, and then somebody else tells, maybe they write a fictional story. I was like, hey, this little boy grew up in the city called Chicago and he had magic powers, right? So if people are reading this story of, the Chicago, let's go with the Chicago fire. Isn't that right? The gal's, the gal whose cow kicked over the thing that caused the Chicago fire. What's that? I don't know if that's, but that old fire that destroyed Chicago. Say this historical event. And then I have little Timmy who has magic powers, lived in the city of Chicago. And people unearth this later. And they say, aha, well, Chicago clearly was a mythical city that couldn't have existed because we see these legends have evolved over time and some were using these same elements. It's like, well, maybe they used the city of Chicago because it was a real thing, not because, and then they invented legends around that thing. And that's, I think, what's happening in Genesis is just because it's using similar of people and names and locations doesn't mean that the truth value of Genesis is undermined. And so if every civilization has a flood story, maybe it's because there was a flood. Maybe it's not because they were just trying to all invent a flood story. Maybe it's because there was a flood. And if there was a flood, is there one of those stories among them that tells us something true about that? Well, as Christians, we believe, yes, there is. And how do we know that the flood story recorded in Genesis is a true flood story, not a myth like the other ones? Well, because we believe the Bible was, revealed by Yahweh and inspired by him. Well, now we're back to biblical authority. That moves to a different realm of apologetics. Can we trust the Bible as the revealed word of God?
If anybody else wants to jump in, feel free, online or in person. I've got a question too so you quoted from some of the ancient Near East myths, and I may have missed it, but I didn't see you quote from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which I think is often put forward as being, parallel to the Genesis story, and again, in Jeff said that, it's often suggested that the Genesis was inspired by or copied the Epic of Gilgamesh. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so if you go back historically and look at when all those things, most scholars at this point, I think, would try to nuance that. Like there were to say, oh, it's a copy story, or they do exactly that. But there's scholars like John Walton who are Christian scholars who argue that it's not that Genesis is copied from these. It's just that because they shared the same worldview, it has similar elements. That's his nuance of that sort of that particular argument. Because there were historically things like, Hebrews copied from the Babylonians, or Hebrews copied from the Akkadians, or Hebrews copied from the Egyptians. You have these different movements. But as more and more evidence came out, they said, well, okay, they're not exactly the same. There's too many differences. We can't make that. So I think most scholars at this point would probably try to say, well, there's elements that are common amongst all these, but because they'll go to that worldview argument. Well, they shared the same culture, language, history, and so they're pulling from these common cultural elements to make these stories seem very similar. So I think it's because they realize there's a weakness in that argument. Ultimately, they're trying to make it less and less direct, and it makes it harder to pin down as the truth. They're trying to make their argument less defeatable by making it say less and less definitively. Yes, it's copied from the Epic of Gilgamesh, which. So I don't think those are sustainable anymore, that it's a direct copy or directly attributable to those sort of things. But I do think they're still trying to make the same basic argument that it's a product of the culture, that Moses wrote what he wrote simply because he was a man of his age. And so his mythology of Genesis is an ancient Near East mythology like all other mythologies. And then when you try to say, what's the evidence? Well, they all sound similar. I think it gets weaker and weaker as it goes. I don't know, does that kind of answer what you were asking for?
Yeah. And in fact, I think you alluded to this as you went through the slides, that most of the ancient Near East mythologies involve some cosmic battle with a victor and, yes, a defeated entity, and the victor became the god that they worshipped. And that Genesis stands alone as a mythology or, a text that doesn't involve a cosmic battle, but one God who created everything, and everything flows from him and through him and is sustained by him. And that's absolutely unique. There isn't another mythology like that around the world, I think, for the most part.
Yeah.
I could be wrong about that.
No, there is nothing like that. It's very unique as far as I've ever been able to see it. And I think, again, it trades in sort of these superficial elements. Let me give you guys an example, if that's okay. I think one of the closest examples comes from the Egyptian Memphite. So when Memphis was rising to power, the city of Memphis, and it sort of unified the northern and southern kingdoms of Egypt under their sort of Memphite theology. There was a god named Ptah, P-T-A-H. And there's a origin story that talks about how Ptah spoke everything into existence. Okay, and it sort of spoke all things. And so his tongue was, talking about a certain part, and his heart of Ptah was doing this. And so it goes in this whole thing, and it sounds very similar, like God said, let there be light, and there was light, because he speaks it into, speaks a little air quotes into existence. So a lot of folks say, see, Moses, of course, he was raised in Egypt, so he's just borrowing this idea of God speaking into existence from this Memphite myth, and he's just giving a justification for why Yahweh spoke it, not Ptah. But the problem with that is that when you read that story, and when you dig into that, you realize that it's not talking about God speaking to existence ex nihilo, out of nothing. It's not God creating out of the force and power of his word, the material reality. What Ptah is doing is saying is there's an existing material world that it has. And when it's saying he's speaking or he's creating humans and animals, what it means is that it was very materially focused, again, because it was saying, look, every human has a tongue and every human has a heart. Every animal has a tongue and every animal has a heart. Therefore, Ptah is the God who dominates all humans and animals. Therefore, our Memphite origin story explains why my God has power over you and your animals and your livestock. It wasn't trying to say that he spoke it into existence. So you can't take these superficial elements like speaking, because we all speak. It's just so rudimentary. Yes, the gods in ancient mythology speak and Yahweh speaks. That doesn't mean, aha, they're all the same. That's like if I tell you the story, Huck Finn, Huckleberry Finn. Well, Tom Sawyer spoke and he wrote down, he piloted a raft. Therefore, every story that talks about people speaking or in rafts are mythologies about the ancient southern world, right? Well, no, it's using common things to explain something deeper. And so you can't just say because Ptah spoke and Yahweh spoke that they're the same origin story. You have to look at the substance of the story and say, are they saying the same thing about those? And Genesis is not saying the same thing at all when Yahweh speaks of what it means when Ptah spoke. So that's I think that's one I think is the most potentially persuasive examples from the people that have this convergent worldview about speaking. But I think that when you read the substance, you realize that's the idea of speaking is really a secondary to the substance of the story.
We have another question in person.
John Walton of Wheaton College speaks as the ancients. The Bible speaks of the dome and gives an image of great contrast to what we know about astronomy today, that there was a dome covering and has little to do with stars being a billion light years away and so on and so forth. So how would you, this has been somewhat troublesome for me to correlate a clearly contrasting perception that they evidently had with what we understand clearly from current science. And that, and also John spoke about, he speaks of the Bible written for us, but not to us. The
Yes.
point being that it was written in the context of the culture of the time.
No, Walton is a big deal. His influence is certainly significant. I've actually done some presentations and written some articles with Walton. And I put a link to an article I had that talks about what makes Genesis different in there. I put a link to where you can download an article that I have published in the Global Journal of Classic Theology regarding John Walton's sort of hermeneutic and the way he does that. But you bring up two really important parts to Walton. Sort of first is this, all the ancients had this world, view of the domed world, this hard dome that was sat there. The problem with his assertion on that is that it's just completely flawed. So Jack Collins, John C. Collins has written on this, actually in Hugh Ross's book that's going to be out this next year. He has a whole chapter dedicated to this, and he's written on it before. I think there's some stuff on the reasons.org site as well that has addressed this, but he has a chapter in the book that's coming out next year. So just to frame this, so I have this talk today is similar to an article that I linked there. That article of mine is chapter 1 in a short book that I'm going to have that comes out next year with Reasons to Believe. And my book is really sort of a companion piece in terms of just sort of filling in a how do we read Genesis type piece to Hugh Ross's very big book. It's pretty long, that will sort of give the defense of this two books approach. But like I said, he has a whole chapter that Hugh Ross is talking about how there's nobody that really, even among the ancients, there's no evidence that, although they describe this sort of domed existence, there's no real evidence that they actually believed in a literal domed structure that went over it. It's like we have common language to us today. When I watch the news at night, when they said, hey, sunrise tomorrow is going to be this and sunset. Well, that's a geocentric version. The sun doesn't rise and the sun doesn't set. We all know that's not true, right? I mean, the sun, we revolve and rotate. We revolve on our own axis, and we rotate around the sun, right? So there is no such thing as a sunrise or a sunset. So, you know, if 1,000 years from now, somebody's watching our news broadcast and they say, oh, look at these foolish ancients in the United States. They still believe the sun was rising and setting. It's like, okay, no, those are just the common way we describe the reality we see. So I think what Walton does is he makes a mistake of saying, because they had this sort of common language set, that he takes it. It's ironic because he says we can't take Genesis literally, but he'll take their statements, you know, literally, that they believed in a literal domed structure. So it's like, at one hand, he's arguing, don't read the Genesis literally, but on the other hand, to make my point, I'm going to assume that they took this, they only meant this as a literal domed structure. So I think he undermines his own argument ultimately for that. I think Hugh's book will kind of summarize why the evidences for that don't exist. And so that whole dome structure thing, it just doesn't make sense. I don't think, and I think people will move away from that. The more that gets analyzed, I think the more people will realize, okay, that's a really bad argument, and they'll slowly move away from that. I think there's a second part to that. Did I address that whole question?
David, what's the second part of your question?
Did that answer your whole question?
Oh, yeah,
I
that's
thought his
how.
other question was the statement that the Bible was written for us, not to us.
Oh, yeah. That's right. I'm glad you remembered that. Thank you. So, I think this is a little linguistic trickery, to be honest, on Walton's part, if I can be frank. You know, I don't know that anybody, you know, I say in my book when it comes out, I say in the article that I linked when it comes out, I know Hugh Ross says in his books, Fuzz Rana says, we're all acknowledging that this was an ancient book written to an ancient people. Nobody denies that. But what he means by that is when it's it's written to, for them, not for us kind of thing. What he means is that we shouldn't take it seriously as a book that tells us about our origins, the universal origins of the universe or universal origins of humans. Because again, he believes in animal to human evolution. He believes that's the true story of human origins. And he has to find a way to say, well, certainly I believe the Bible is inspired and inerrant, but it doesn't tell us about our human origins. Why does he need that to happen? He needs that to happen again, because he needs to find a way to say that only the consensus science of animal to human evolution tells us our true history. And he doesn't want a conflict between the text of the Bible and what he thinks is the authoritative primary source of his magisterial source of science, consensus. So that's what his statement is trying to do. Is he's trying to say science has magisterial authority over human origins. The Bible has secondary authority over human origins. So that's what that means to him. When I say stuff like that, or Hugh Ross or Fuzz Rana or those reasons to believe say that, we're saying, hey, it's an ancient story it's certainly written to and for an ancient people, but it was inspired, and it gives us a transcendent truth about origins as well. It's not one or the other, it's a both and. So yes, it was written to and for those people, but it was also written to and for us. There's nothing, because it was written by a God who transcends culture. So Walton tries to make it an either or. Oh, it can only be written to them or to us. And it's just a false dichotomy. It's just a false, problem that he's trying to create. It's the horns of a dilemma that's easily resolved by saying, no, it's just God transcends that. It can be both and.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Am I correct in thinking that it's valid to say the importance of context? There are things that were not written specifically to be taken literally by me. Today, if I have to acknowledge the context, people to whom it was written, and make an application today, or draw principles
Yes.
that apply to me, but not try and take everything for myself personally.
That's very true. That's correct. And I don't know anybody who would not agree with that in large part. Even the most, the strongest defenders of young Earth creation. I studied with young Earth creationists. I've been around those folks for many years, and there's some really good scholars within that camp that I would say today they're doing a good job. But none of those would deny. Everyone would agree with what you say. There's a context for that, and there's a way that we have to interpret the text. We got to realize it just doesn't map directly onto everything we do today. So it's that word literal that we get stuck on, because it means, I don't think it's a helpful word these days, because we all kind of interpret that a little differently, and so we put a little bit of baggage into that word. So we mean certain things, different things by that when we say it. I always tell folks, I don't always take the Bible literally, but I always take it seriously. And so it's always a serious thing that I have to understand. What is it saying? It has a historic context, historic meaning. How do I connect that to my life today, and then translate to make sure it applies to what my life is today? So yes, you're right. I think what you summarized there is the right approach. And I don't know that anybody really of significance disagrees with that approach. And those that argue that, they use the word literal as a pejorative, as a bludgeon against people's view, without really dealing, I think, faithfully with what most people are trying to say. So I think we're all trying to get to that same thing. And if we just sort of take time to listen to folks and read what they're saying, we'll see that we're all in that area. We just have to be a little more cautious how we are interpreting others who are speaking these things.
Well, this was excellent. We try to be respectful of people's time. We go until 11:30, and we've hit that mark, Joe. This was a very good presentation, thought-provoking. I appreciate the 2 articles. I will try to post those on the Facebook event page. I'll also, if I remember, try to email them out to people on our email list. I also want to kind of highlight, we're back in gear now that it's fall. We have speakers lined up for October, November, and December. In October, we're going to get kind of the front end of the presentation today. We got kind of the back end, the Hebrew cosmology. Today we're going to get, or in October, Pat McGuire is going to talk about recent advances in cosmology and astronomy and their implications. In November, we're going to take a little break from hard science to learn about making sense of mass shootings, which obviously is kind of a hot current topic, and then come back to a more scientific presentation on epigenetics from Von Mancha in